Before power was measured in market share, it was measured in territory. Let's review the ultimate strategists. Power does not spend most of its life in battles, coups, or coronations. The historical puzzle is not just who prevailed, but why did rulers keep investing in elaborate, repeated public ceremony long after their initial claim to power was already established? At first glance, the answer can look personal, as if one stronger figure simply outmaneuvered weaker rivals and the rest of the system followed. The pressure is immediate. That explanation is too thin for the pressure we are studying, because durability between crises may depend on recurring ceremonial reinforcement functioning as an ongoing maintenance system, separate from one-time legitimation. So the promise of this episode is a structural reading of power, legitimacy, and institutional durability, not another heroic summary of events. The pressure is immediate, the structure is exposed. Why did rulers keep investing in elaborate, repeated public ceremony long after their initial claim to power was already established? That is the tension the institution has to absorb before uncertainty becomes political opportunity. The problem begins when authority can fade from everyday perception during quiet periods unless the state keeps making hierarchy, continuity, and central presence visible again and again. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and affode. Once that happens, leadership becomes a test of architecture, not charisma, because every layer below the center starts judging what still deserves obedience. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. The distinction is between one-time legitimation when power is secured and ongoing ceremonial reinforcement that keeps authority feeling present afterward. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all recalibrate. When that distinction is blurred, people often misread a structural weakness as a personal drama and then miss the mechanism actually driving the instability. Everyone starts recalculating. The risk spreads quickly. That is why the stakes are broader than one ruler, one faction, or one disputed decision. Everyone starts recalculating. The risk spreads quickly. The structure feels fragile. Everyone starts recalculating. If authority leans too heavily on presence alone, the institution eventually discovers how little of itself it can carry without constant personal intervention. That pressure matters because elites, officers, officials, and subjects all begin recalculating. The lens here is performative authority maintenance theory, and the point of that lens is to separate visible command from the quieter structures that make command durable. The distinction matters here. Performative authority maintenance theory, how recurring ceremony and spectacle can repeatedly refresh the public impression of order, hierarchy, and legitimacy between major political events. The distinction matters here. The mechanism is becoming clearer. In conceptual terms, this mechanism matters because leadership can appear strongest precisely where the institution underneath it is least prepared to function alone. The distinction matters here. The mechanism is becoming clearer. The goal is not to pretend every historical setting is the same. It is to see where the same kind of institutional pressure keeps reappearing under different surfaces. Personal brilliance can dominate the scene, while institutional design determines whether the scene can be repeated after that brilliance weakens, disappears, or changes hands. The distinction matters here. That is why we are not asking whether leaders matter. We are asking what kind of structure their leadership leaves behind for everyone else to inhabit. The distinction matters here. Success in the short run can hide a delayed weakness if the system still depends on habits, permissions, or loyalties that only one person knows how to coordinate. The thesis then is deliberately simple to state and much harder to build in practice. The durability of authority between crises may depend on recurring ceremonial reinforcement functioning as an ongoing maintenance system separate from. The first point is temporal. Acquiring authority and sustaining authority are related but distinct political tasks. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. A coronation, conquest settlement, or founding moment can establish a claim. Yet most reigns are lived in the long intervals after that claim has already been announced. That is the mechanism. During those intervals, ceremony functions as maintenance, not origin. It keeps hierarchy visible before doubt has to erupt openly. That is how personal rule either hardens into structure or collapses back into improvisation under pressure. Repeated spectacle matters because political order is partly sensory. People often believe in endurance through what they repeatedly see enacted around them. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. Ceremony, therefore, does more than decorate power. It stages continuity, sequence, precedence, and centrality in ways ordinary observers can recognize without legal theory. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. The ruler's body, court choreography, public access patterns, and repeated symbolic rhythms all help teach what stable authority is supposed to look like. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. This is why rulers invest in repetition, not novelty alone. A practice becomes stronger politically when it becomes expected, not merely impressive once. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. Recurring ceremony also disciplines elites by showing them where they stand relative to one another inside a living hierarchy that keeps being publicly renewed. That is the mechanism. For wider populations, the same performance can make the state appear larger, older, and more continuous than any one moment of local hardship or rumor. That is the mechanism. That does not mean ceremony works by illusion alone. It works partly by shaping ordinary expectation of what order should keep looking like tomorrow. That is the mechanism. The mechanism is strongest when ceremony aligns with working institutions, because repeated performance then confirms something people also experience materially. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. It becomes weaker when spectacle drifts too far from lived capacity, leaving grandeur unable to compensate for visible administrative decay. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. This helps explain why ceremonies continue long after legitimacy seems established. Authority decays if left politically invisible for too long. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. The state, therefore, rehearses itself in public, turning hierarchy into a sequence of repeated experiences, not a fact remembered only from exceptional moments. That is the mechanism. The institutional effect is real. The strategic question is whether ceremony remains a living reinforcement of authority or hardens into empty form that no longer refreshes belief under stress. That is the mechanism. A fair counterpoint is that some ceremonial investment may reflect court habit, vanity, or inherited precedent, not a fully conscious maintenance strategy. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. The limitation is that the causal contribution of ceremony is difficult to isolate from prosperity, coercion, coalition support, and administrative competence happening alongside it. The limits still matter. Ceremonial reinforcement fails when the performance of power becomes detached from institutional reality so completely that repetition begins to look hollow, not reassuring. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. There is also exception in moments of exceptional external danger, when emergency action can matter more politically than repeated court display. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. Strategic effectiveness and moral legitimacy remain separate, because repeated ceremony can stabilize authority without making that authority just or humane. The limits still matter. The trade-off stays real. Even so, the pattern remains useful. Where authority is repeatedly staged in credible, expected forms, rulers often preserve a stronger public impression of continuity between crises. The limits still matter. Taken together, those boundaries do not erase the mechanism. They stop us from mistaking one useful explanation for a complete and universal theory of power. The limits still matter. So we can now return to the opening question with sharper terms, less mythology, and a clearer view of what the institution was actually carrying. That is the bounded answer. Rulers kept investing in ceremony because authority weakens when it disappears from lived public experience, and recurring spectacle helped keep hierarchy, continuity, and central presence politically visible between open crises. In that sense, leadership is partly the craft of shaping conditions under which authority can move, persist, and still look usable after the central figure changes. That is the bounded answer. When that design fails, successors inherit titles, offices, or territories without inheriting the machinery that once made them governable. That answer remains qualified, yet it explains more than a personality-based reading. When the design holds, conflict, rivalry, or uncertainty can remain because people still expect the institution to continue tomorrow. That answer remains qualified, yet it explains more than a personality reading. The real measure, then, is not whether a ruler ever looked powerful. It is whether the system learned how to keep functioning when power had to travel through other hands. Strategic effectiveness and moral legitimacy remain separate questions, Yet both influence whether authority can endure without immediate collapse, improvisation, or deeper coercion. That is the bounded answer. The explanation still holds. That is the resolution. Durable leadership builds arrangements stronger than presence, while brittle leadership leaves everyone waiting for a person who is no longer enough. That is the bounded answer. Once that becomes visible, the topic stops looking like pageantry and starts looking like a disciplined question about structure, incentives, continuity, and institutional memory. That is the bounded answer. Study the architecture of command by asking how a system keeps authority visible during ordinary time, not only during founding or emergency moments. Ask the structural question. Authority moves through institutions, but it also moves through repeated public performances that teach people what stable order is supposed to look like. Ask the structural question. Remove the ceremonial surface, and the deeper issue becomes whether spectacle is still reinforcing a living hierarchy or merely disguising its erosion. Ask the structural question. This outcome cannot be reduced to vanity alone, because recurring performance can function as political maintenance when it remains tied to institutional reality. Ask the structural question. Strategic effectiveness is not legitimacy, yet the lesson remains that authority often survives by staying perceptible between crises. Ask the structural question. Look at the institution. The practical reframing is to ask which role, routine, office, coalition, expectation, or resource channel is carrying the system when personal certainty begins to fade. The safer historical question is not who seemed most impressive in the moment, but which structure kept functioning when pressure rose and authority had to travel farther. The unresolved dilemma remains whether recurring ceremony continues to refresh belief in authority or slowly becomes an expensive performance that no longer compensates for deeper institutional weakness. Keep that question in view the next time a political story turns structure into personality and contingency into myth. The throne changes, the strategy remains. Until next time.